We're talking to Martin Ford, the author of Rise of the Robots, Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future. Welcome to Redera.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. The title is a little bit alarming, and I'm sure there are reasons for it. What is the book all about?
Really, it's about the advance of artificial intelligence and robotics, information technology in general, and the basic thesis of the book is that over time, machines are increasingly going to substitute for workers. We already see that robots and smart algorithms are getting better and better at doing more routine, repetitive, predictable things, and that's something that is likely to, I think, accelerate over the next 10 or 20 years, and it's going to potentially impact a huge number of jobs across industries, all kinds of occupations, and actually all kinds of skill levels as well. And I think it has big implications for society.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. If you would explain to people who are not aware of how far the technological advances have happened, especially in the last 10 years, and what is more likely to come in the next 5 years, then people will probably understand the scope of the problem that we may be facing going forward.
Right. I mean, I think that one technology that you can really focus on that's kind of central to this is machine learning, and it's really taking off, and it's happening because of two things. The idea of building learning algorithms that can actually learn has been around for a long time, but what's different is that they've come up with some new techniques, especially something called deep learning, which is really accelerating. And also, together with that, there's just now fantastic amounts of data out there. And those two things go together. You need the algorithms, and you also need the data that the algorithms can operate on and learn from. So we're finally getting to the point where both of these things are coming together with the fact that computers are now so much faster. And that's really just generating some amazing advances, and we're seeing that applied in lots of areas. I mean, there are systems that do basic journalism, and there are systems that are taking some of the basic work that lawyers used to do, and there are just really some amazing examples all over the place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Are there any one or two industries that you can kind of explain with some example that they're really seeing the impact of that right now, and that may be at the cusp of losing a large chunk of the employment base?
Well, I mean, in general, the important message here is that it's really across the board. It's going to impact every industry, but you can certainly point out some areas. I mean, self-driving cars is one thing that relies heavily on machine learning, and it looks like those are going to begin to arrive within just the next few years. There are lots of pilot projects out there, and once those technologies become viable and widespread, I mean, that's potentially millions and millions of jobs. In many U.S. states and in many countries, actually driving a vehicle is perhaps the most common occupation for men that don't have a university degree. So it's just an enormous number of people that are going to be impacted. As I said, we see an impact in journalism. There are now smart systems that can tap into a data stream and automatically generate a news story from that. And this is being used by some of the biggest media organizations in the United States already. And you can read those stories, and it's not at all obvious that they were written by a machine and not by a person. And this is something that right now is operating at kind of a very basic level, but it's going to get dramatically better over the next 10 or 20 years. So it's easy to find examples where we're seeing an impact already, but the important point is that we're really at just the leading edge of this, and it's going to get dramatically better going forward.
Sounds very scary. So what do policymakers can learn from, or what can they do from this?
Well, I think policymakers need to begin to understand that we're headed for a real disruption, a time when things are going to operate in a way that's fundamentally different from what we've seen in the past. And, historically, there's always been only basically one conventional solution to this. And the idea is that if machines automate some low-skill, repetitive job, then workers will lose that job, and then we send those workers back to school. They can then move up the skills ladder and do something more elaborate, something that needs more intellectual input and so forth. But what we're seeing now really is that technology is also climbing that skills ladder. So a lot of jobs that actually require more education and training are being impacted. So what that means, or what I think it means, is that this idea that just throwing more education and training at the problem is going to solve it is not going to be viable forever. I think that ultimately we're going to need something more radical than that, and that's the reason that I've advocated in my book that we may need to think about perhaps a guaranteed income or a universal basic income, something along those lines eventually.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The machine intelligence, as you pointed out, has become very smart and is only going to get smarter and smarter in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and so on. What is driving that? Is it just a chip technology? Is it just, are there multiple technologies coming together to accelerate the advances?
There are a variety of technologies, but as I said, the one thing that's really taking off now is machine learning, and the most important example of what's happening in machine learning is what's called deep learning, which is essentially a new twist on a neural network, which is a system that is essentially, works in kind of a primitive simulation of the way the human brain works. And these neural networks have been around for decades, way back since the 1940s, and they've been used to do very basic pattern recognition type tasks. But just in the last decade or so, there have been some real advances, some real breakthroughs in building neural networks that are much more complex, that have many more layers to them. And that's what's called deep learning, and it's being used all over the place. Google is heavily into deep learning. Amazon and Facebook are competing. There's a tremendous competitive dynamic there to really push this technology forward. It's being used, for example, to translate languages. It's used in Google's translation. Microsoft recently built a system for Skype that could in real time translate Chinese to English. So as you speak, it can actually translate. So you're seeing some really amazing breakthroughs there. And again, that's something that's getting better and better. And it's happening because the algorithms, the software is better, and the computers are much faster. And again, there's all this data out there for these algorithms to operate on. So it's all of those things kind of coming together that's really pushing that forward, together with this tremendous competitive dynamic where you've got, Facebook and Google and Microsoft in kind of a war to compete against each other and to get the best people to really push these technologies forward. So that's really what's causing it to take off.
So it looks like that the white collars that were once the bedrock of middle class, they are just as badly likely to be impacted as the blue collar jobs have been.
That's right, and in fact, that's one of the paradoxes of it, is that in some cases, the white-collar jobs may be easier to automate than the blue-collar job. And the reason is the blue-collar job requires lots of mobility and visual perception and hand-eye coordination or dexterity. I mean, it's really hard to build a robot that can match what a human being can do in terms of fine motor skills and being able to, visually look at an environment and then manipulate that environment physically. I mean, we're definitely making a lot of progress there, but still human beings have an advantage. Whereas, and of course, to automate that kind of job is expensive. You need, expensive machinery and machine vision equipment and robotic arms and all of that. I mean, it costs a lot of money. Whereas an information job or a knowledge worker job, very often you can automate just with software. You don't need any of this expensive stuff. So the person that's sitting in front of a computer doing something, fairly routine and predictable, often that job can be easier to get rid of than the lower skill blue collar worker. And of course, that worker, that information worker, in many cases also earns more money. So there's a bigger incentive to get rid of that job as well. So that's what we're beginning to see.
At the same time, the cost of education and healthcare are exploding. So it's going to be a double whammy on both the sides, and it's going to have impact a lot of employees. I mean, a lot of families.
That's right. I mean, you're seeing that already, in terms of what's happening with the economy, which is that wages or incomes have been stagnant for most average people, whereas the cost of healthcare and education and in many cases housing has been soaring, and it's just squeezing people more and more and leaving them with less money to spend. And that's, I think, part of the problem we have with our economy now is that we don't have vibrant consumers out there because people are getting squeezed so much. And that's something that's going to get worse for sure as a result of this trend.
Now, do you see that this rise of deep learning as one of the technologies that we talked about, that there might be other countries that may be also playing a big role in it? Chinese are always moving in, Indians are always in it, Europeans are probably looking into this, or is strictly American domain right now?
No, it's definitely a global process. China is very competitive. Baidu, their main web search company, is very heavily into deep learning, and they're also building self-driving cars and all the stuff, doing all the same stuff that Google is doing. India has certainly got many companies that are highly competitive as well. So there's a very strong competitive dynamic, both between individual corporations and between countries as well. And of course, some of this also has military applications and security applications. So there's another dynamic going on there, for example, between the U.S. and China and so forth.
Yeah, so that's just going to accelerate the pace of innovation even more. Because
that's right, because there's just a tremendous competition going on between the very, and there's a talent war going on for the very smartest people that have these specialized knowledge how to develop these systems. So that's one of the things that's driving it all the faster.
And probably it also is going to accelerate the levels of inequality that we have in this country and probably around the world as well.
That's right. I mean, what's happening is that many average people are, losing opportunity. Either the jobs are going to disappear entirely, or increasingly the jobs may be de-skilled, which means the machines turn the workers into commodities that they don't really need any special skills, and that means that the wages are going to be lower, just as you see, for example, in the fast food industry. So in general, what's happening is that capital is becoming more valuable relative to labor. And of course, most people in the world, I mean, the only marketable asset that they really have is the value of their labor. What they do is they trade their labor for income, and that's how they survive. And what we're seeing going forward is that labor for huge numbers of people is going to become less valuable. And machines, as they take over more of that, will become more valuable. But the problem, of course, is that, machines are capital, and the distribution of capital is very, very unequal. A few people own all the capital. So it's going to really make inequality worse as more average people find that their labor is worth less, whereas the very most wealthy people who own lots of capital are what they have is going to become more valuable.
I think you've raised this in the book somewhere that about half the jobs in America could be automated, the other quarter could be outsourced or offshored. So then you're down to only 25% left of all the current employment base. It's pretty dire prognosis there.
Well, I mean, there's probably a lot of overlap between the jobs that can be offshored and the jobs that can be automated. In fact, what we see very often is that jobs are offshored first, and then later on, as technology advances, they could be automated. And that's what we're seeing. For example, the offshoring industry in India has already experienced that to some extent, where some of the jobs that they used to have now been automated. And that's a trend that will grow in the future. So, but yeah, in general, there are estimates that are kind of scary. The 50% estimate came from a couple of academics at Oxford University who did an analysis of the job market in the United States. And basically what they did is they looked at jobs to see if they would ultimately be susceptible to machine learning, if they were predictable enough. And they came to the conclusion that maybe about half of the jobs could eventually be automated, perhaps over the next couple of decades. So that's a pretty scary number. And I wouldn't put too much faith in that exact estimate, like half of the jobs, but it doesn't really matter whether it's half of the jobs or 30% of the jobs, or 20% of the jobs. I mean, those are all huge numbers. I mean, you're talking about a staggering impact on the economy and on society. So,
and once they're
regardless of what the exact number is, the fact that it's that big is definitely cause for concern.
Mm-hmm. How do you see this paradigm that, okay, you have more robots doing more stuff, and that means you have fewer and fewer people working. That means you have fewer and fewer people who have income. That means you have fewer and fewer customers. So there's not enough work for the robots to do. So
that's right. So eventually, if you get into that scenario, you run out of people that can buy what's being produced, and then you kind of get into a downward spiral, a deflationary spiral. So that's got one dystopian outcome. And that's, again, one of the best reasons to have something like a guaranteed income, so that you make not just so that people can survive and not be, living on the street, but also so that they will have some money to spend, so that they can become consumers and then drive the economy. Now, if you imagine a solution like that, where you start off with, maybe a very low guaranteed income, and then over time, as the economy grows, you raise the level of that, then you can imagine kind of a very utopian outcome, right, where everyone is doing fine, even though they're not working. People, have more leisure time, more time for other things that are important to them. People don't have to do dangerous, dirty jobs or jobs that they dislike. So this could all have a very positive outcome. It doesn't have to be a negative thing, but in order to get on the path to that kind of utopian scenario, we're going to have to make an adaptation. We're going to have to do, figure out a way to adapt to this. And I think one good way to do that would be that guaranteed income.
Mm-hmm. In the early 80s and late 70s, and mostly in the early 80s, the computers were getting more and more powerful, and there were obviously a lot of people resisting the use of computers because they thought it would take over everything, it would destroy us. And here we are after almost 30 years, and computers have only gotten smarter and cheaper, and yet people are employed and people are working and jobs are created and money spent. So how do you think, but what I'm trying to say is a lot of people think that this is just going to be this deep learning like technologies will also unfold in the same way, but what you're saying is, that's not going to happen, this is different.
Yeah, I do believe that this time is different, and to some extent it's just a matter of degree. The fact that computers are so much faster now, and that we now have the beginnings of at least specialized artificial intelligence, where machines are beginning to, in effect, think in a limited way, but in a much broader sense than they did previously. I mean, initially computers they were really tools used by workers, and they could do calculations and they could automate your typing rather than having a receptionist do it. And certainly jobs were lost, but other jobs were created. But I do think that as computers begin to think more holistically and take on more and more of the decision making and the general cognitive tasks, that eventually what happens is that they begin to really encroach on the capability of a lot of average workers, so that a lot of people are kind of left with no marketable skills. They're disenfranchised as the computers really become capable of doing nearly everything that an average person is capable of doing. And I mean, and obviously that's not going to be true of everyone. No one is saying that all the jobs are going to disappear, but I think that what will happen in the future is that there will be fewer jobs, and there will also be a significant mismatch between the kinds of jobs that are available and the skills that average people have. I mean, if you go to MIT and you get your PhD in developing artificial intelligence or something, then you're probably okay. You don't have to worry. You'll have a job. But the people that are now flipping hamburgers and driving taxis and doing all kinds of routine work are not going to be able to transition into that type of job. I mean, it's not realistic to expect that. So that's the problem that I see going forward.
Mm-hmm. So economy will have to bear the burden of the larger section of the population that would not be employable, and they will have to obviously be taken care of and turned into customers.
That's right.
And the guaranteed minimum income is one way of doing that in your way of thinking.
It's one good way of approaching that. I mean, there may be other ways, but I think that's the most straightforward and easiest way, and it's an idea that has a lot of history behind it. Very prominent people like Friedrich Hayek, for example, who's a very famous libertarian economist, was a big supporter of a guaranteed income way back in the 1930s. It's an idea that has been around for quite a while and has some support. I think it's a very good way to approach this problem.
And you probably also think that, yes, we need smart robots, yes, we need advanced robots, and yes, we need to continue on the path of advancing and innovation, but it will take fewer and fewer but smarter people to keep on that path. So the amount of people needed to keep that acceleration going is going to be less and less.
Right. So it's going to, be a more elite group of people, like the people that work at Google, for example, right? I mean, it's a very elite group of people. I mean, they have extraordinary education and they're extremely smart and capable. I mean, they're not average people, right? And that, the whole economy is probably going to look more like that, where if you really want to have a good, solid job and a chance to really compete, you're going to need more skills at that level, and that's probably going to leave a lot of people behind. That's my concern, So we need to have a way of adapting to that. We can't just pretend that that's not the case and that everything will work out if it won't.
Yeah, so I think the capitalism will have to adjust to it, because otherwise, if there's a capitalism without compassion, then they won't have the customers.
That's right, and if we get into that situation, then of course many people will start saying capitalism doesn't work. The Michael Moore type people are going to become much more influential, and they're going to say capitalism failed. Let's throw it out. Let's go back to socialism. I think that would be a really bad idea, because socialism has been proven not to work very well. So what we want to do is we want to adapt capitalism so that it can continue to thrive in the future as this new reality unfolds. And again, a good way to do that would be to introduce a guaranteed income.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you think about the people who generally lose a job and at the end of the last strand on the rope, people are very creative when they're pushed into. When they lose their job and their livelihood is gone, they find a way to survive. We are known for our survival instincts. Do you think that creativity will kick in and they will find a way around it?
Well, I think that to some extent it will. People certainly will be creative, yes, and they will do things. And I think that that's not at odds with the idea of a guaranteed income. One of the points I make in the book is that if you give everyone just a basic income floor, and I'm not talking about something very generous that everyone's going to live like a cushy life, but at least you give them a minimal survivable income, then of course people aren't going to be satisfied with that, right? They're going to do things on top of that. They're going to go out and start a business. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that if you give people a safety net, they will take more risk. Suppose you're working in some boring job at a company that you've been in a long time, you're not learning anything, but you stay in that job because you need the income. If you knew that you were guaranteed some minimum level of income, you might be more willing to quit that job and do something more innovative, right? Start your own business or take a job at a smaller, more innovative company and so forth. So if you provide people with that basic floor on their income, you might well end up with a more dynamic entrepreneurial economy.
Well, we have, almost at one point during the 2008 and 9, the depth of Great Recession we had, about 50% of almost one in every 2 households was on food stamp in the country. And that number has not receded too much. It's still around 35, 37%, somewhere in that vicinity. I don't know the exact number. But this could have a different dimensions. You could get food stamps. Yes, you'll have the food on the table, but you still have to do something to do your living and get ahead in life and so on. And I think that's what you're saying. The guaranteed minimum income just keeps you alive. But people's survival instincts kick in, and they want to do more, and they want to kind of develop more in different ways for themselves.
Right. I mean, and in a country as advanced as the United States, we want people to have that incentive to be creative and do something, but we don't necessarily want to say to you, if you fail at that, you're going to be homeless on the street, right? I mean, I think it's reasonable to provide people with some minimal level, and I think most people will want more than that. There may be exceptions, and one of the concerns about a guaranteed income is that people will just be lazy slackers. For the most part, I don't think that will happen. And in fact, there have been some pilot programs that have been done in India, for example, recently that showed very positive results. But some people will be lazy for sure, but not most people. And the fact that some people will choose to take their income and just play video games or something is a cost that we probably will have to absorb, I think.
Yeah. There's going to be a new kind of lazy people out there that we have never thought about, How did you get interested in this topic? What brought you to writing a book on this topic?
Well, I run a very small software company in Silicon Valley for a while. I started the business back in the 1990s, and it started out doing Windows software. So I developed, like technical niche type applications for Microsoft Windows. And back then, running a software company was fairly labor intensive. I mean, you needed workers because software was shipped on physical media. It was shipped on CD-ROMs, and there was a manual, and all this stuff had to be put in a box, and it had to be sent to the customer. And producing all of that and fulfilling those orders took, work. And I actually, what I did, and I ran my little business, I found another business that specialized in doing that kind of work, and I outsourced all of that to them. And they hired, regular people, right? People that didn't necessarily have huge amounts of education, and they did all this work. But what happened was that just within a few years of when I started the business, all of that work rapidly just kind of disappeared, because before you knew it, software started to be shipped electronically over the internet. And now today, of course, software maybe isn't even delivered to the customer at all. It might just be hosted in the cloud. So all of those jobs involving producing and shipping physical media and so forth have disappeared. And the same thing has happened, of course, in the music industry, and it's happened with ebooks and so forth. So a lot of those jobs have disappeared. So as I was involved in that, it became kind of obvious to me that eventually this kind of thing was going to happen in the whole economy as artificial intelligence and robotics became more important. It wasn't just going to be software. It was going to be everywhere where jobs were going to start to disappear, So that got me thinking about it. And back in 2009, I wrote my first book, and the title of that book was The Lights in the Tunnel, and it was a self-published book. And that's how I really started getting into this and writing it. And that book, over the course of about 5 years, did well enough and got enough attention that I was offered the opportunity to write this second book, Rise of the Robot. So that's how I really got into this.
What was your experience as a self-publishing author? Obviously, the internet made it happen, and it's a big change that, as you mentioned, the disruption is happening in the publishing industry itself, just like in the software industry and retailing industry, and many other industries are adjusting to it. What was your experience having this kind of perspective that you have?
Well, it was a positive experience, certainly. It wasn't initially my choice. I mean, I started off by trying to find a traditional publisher, or even to try to find an agent, because nowadays, if you want to have a book published, you really need to have an agent. And I sent a lot of emails. I didn't have any connection, and I wasn't able to find one. I got a lot of rejection. So finally, I just decided, okay, I'll just publish it myself. And I used Amazon's platform, which is actually entirely free. It doesn't cost anything. You just basically upload all the files and press a button, and it's published on Amazon. And that worked out well. The problem with that, of course, is that when it's published on Amazon, that means it's up there with who knows how many other millions of books, and no one knows about it. So you've got to do all of the marketing yourself. And I worked on that really for years. I mean, I sent emails to journalists and try to get them interested in this. And it was really hard. I mean, I think the first month that the book was up there on Amazon, it might have sold, 3 copies or something, because basically no one knew about it. So over a process of 5 years, I did manage to get more attention for the book, and in part that's because the issue began to get onto the radar. People became more interested in it. Here I'd written a book about the impact of automation on the job market, so that naturally led them to the book. So it did get some traction and sold enough copies. I think up to now, that first book has probably sold something like about 20,000 copies in paperback and ebook versions. So that was enough to get a traditional publisher interested in the second book.
Right.
But it was a long process. It took about 5 years.
Took about 5 years. Yeah, but it does offer a new avenue to reach out, to a different group of audience that you would not be able to otherwise.
That's right. I mean, in general, what you see with self-publishing is that fiction, I think, does better. I mean, certain people have really been enormously successful writing novels and reaching certain groups of future. For nonfiction, it's a little harder, I think, because you've got to get publicity and so forth. But it's definitely a different avenue, especially if you have something that you think is important that you want to write about, and you haven't been offered the opportunity, from a traditional publisher, which frankly isn't easy.
Do you think you are interested, or you're working on any other topic that may turn into books going forward?
No, not yet. My latest book, Rise of the Robots, which was published by a traditional publisher, has only been out for about a year now. It was published last May, and it's still doing fairly well. And I'm mostly spending my time now traveling around doing speaking engagements. I speak to lots of different groups and conferences and so forth about the book. And that's really how I'm spending a lot of my time now. And that's a good experience for me. I meet a lot of people and learn a lot of things. And eventually, yes, I will probably think about writing another book. But as I said, there were 5 years between my first book and my second book. So after only a year, I don't think I'm at the point yet where I'm ready for that. I think I need more time to kind of assimilate what's happening out there, and hopefully that will generate some new ideas going forward. But for now, I'm quite happy to spend my time getting the message out about this book, and more importantly, the broader issue of what artificial intelligence and robotics are going to mean for the workforce and for the economy and for society. I think it's really a critical discussion that I'm happy to contribute to.
When you go around the country and talk to people and deliver this message, what kind of reaction you're getting from people? Are people afraid? Are people open to adjustments? Or are people coming up with creative solutions that how can we deal with this? Because this is going to happen. It's unstoppable. It's unavoidable.
Yeah, I mean, I generally I'm getting a positive response in that many people sort of sense this, and I've gone, I mean, not just around the country, but really around the whole world. I just came back from Korea and Switzerland on my latest trip. So audiences everywhere are extremely interested and very receptive. They are, I think, beginning to be concerned about it. They see evidence of what's happening. They are interested in solutions, like guaranteed income. Some people are very skeptical of that and find, I've certainly talked to people that have a very visceral, strong reaction to the idea that we should just give everyone an income, give everyone money. They find that kind of horrifying. But, other people are much more receptive. So I think right now we're at the stage where the important thing is to begin a conversation about this, get more people thinking about it and talking about it. And the hope is that from that will emerge some practical solutions.
Rather than giving people money, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, why not make the education accessible to everyone, the higher level education, which costs almost $50,000 a year, and make that accessible so more people will have the opportunity to build those robots or deal with those robots rather than be the victims of those robots?
Well, I think to some extent that will happen. I mean, there are certainly trends you can see in education with massive online courses and robotic teaching systems and so forth. It's going to make education a lot cheaper and more accessible. It hasn't really met expectations, so far, but I think eventually there's a good chance that we will get there and education will be cheaper. But that doesn't mean that you're going to take everyone and turn them into a robotics or AI expert. I mean, there is a basic bell curve in terms of human capability or intelligence, whatever you want to talk about it, and you can't turn everyone into a rocket scientist. So yes, it's great that those opportunities will be there, and we'll do that to the extent possible, but I still don't think that's going to solve the problem with all the millions and millions of people who are now, working in factories or driving cars or flipping hamburgers or working at Walmart. You can't turn all those people into scientific researchers or something. I mean, that's not very realistic as a solution. So I think that education by itself probably is not going to be enough.
We have been speaking with Martin Ford, the author of The Rise of the Robots, the Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future. Thank you very much for your time and your comments. And wonderful read, and I would encourage people to read and start thinking about the implications of it.
Thanks. It's really great to be here.
Thank you.